Welcome to series 2 of Crime Tapes. Now, throughout this series, we're still in a situation where we're dealing with the pandemic, and as a result of that, we're having to record these podcasts in a slightly different way, including from home. So the sound quality might not be that we had in series 1. Please do bear with us a little bit on the quality of sound, which throughout the series of episodes you might find is impacted by the circumstances that we're dealing with. Hi there, you're listening to Crime Tapes. This overall podcast today is going to be about prisons and imprisonment, and in particular we're going to be talking about crime, terror and radicalisation as it occurs in prison. But also we're going to think about how that creates new threats and new problems for law enforcement. This podcast is created in association with Staffordshire University and hosted by the School for Law, Policing and Forensics and the Centre for Crime, Justice and Security. My name's Professor James Treadwell and I'm a criminologist. Today I'm joined by my guest Hannah Bennett, who's a PhD researcher here at Staffordshire, and her PhD research involves crime in prisons, and in particular crime, terror and prisons. So Hannah, thanks for joining me today. I suppose I started off by saying you're a PhD researcher and you're here at Staffordshire looking at a topic that I'm sure a lot of people have heard about, terrorism and organised crime in prisons, and a topic that's certainly been in the press recently. But how did you come to choose this as a topic to study a PhD on?
Hello, James, and hello, everyone else. So I chose this topic partly because I had an interest in both organised crime in prison and how criminals are convicted. People assume they then go to prison and that's it, their crime stops. And obviously, as we know and many people might know, that doesn't happen. Lots of criminals continue their criminality in prison. And then I also had an interest in radicalisation. So it is in the news regularly. There is lots of radicalisation going on in prisons. So I initially had this interest in these two elements. And over the first few months of studying the PhD, I came to realise, realistically, this is the crime-terror nexus within prison. So that's kind of how it came about. And my overall interest in this area came about predominantly from doing my master's with Staffordshire University in transnational organised crime. There was elements in there of organised crime. There was elements of counter-terrorism, terrorism, and I had a big interest in that. So, yeah, that's kind of really where it stemmed from.
And without saying too much as well, but it is also tied to your professional background, isn't it? You also work in the field, so you came in initially with an interest, but you also have a working connection.
Correct, yes. So, yeah, I previously worked in law enforcement, but particularly within the prisons. So I worked within prisons and policing in that relationship, policing the prisons, intelligence gathering, developing. My new role more recently is still intelligence gathering and within law enforcement, but slightly less involved in prisons. But as you realise, yeah, my interest isn't just from an interest in academia, it's the working environment too. And I realised when I was working within the prisons department that there was this disconnect between the counter-terrorism departments and the organised crime departments. And at times they didn't fully know always what each other was doing. So that kind of helped my decision on going forward with the PhD. Absolutely.
Spot the area where you think that there's something to be said and something interesting, and essentially that kind of pulled you in, and it's an interesting background and an interesting kind of pathway in, because I think a lot of the time the framing of these debates, I mean, we'll start off with, because I can understand that if people do know a little bit about the field, I mean, some of the things that you say I agree wholeheartedly with, but I think one or two might start off by being a little bit kind of controversial, because people kind of automatically, like you say, assume that, people are in prisons, and prisons are really controlled of our environment. So, the crime in prisons, it's not something criminologists have looked at an awful lot, is it?
Yeah, I agree. Particularly organised crime in prison and the crime terror nexus. I would say that the radicalisation extremist side has definitely picked up in academia over the last five or 10 years, but it's still under researched. And organised crime in prison and crime terror nexus in prison is really under researched. The crime terror nexus itself, which we'll go into in a minute, but that is. It has been researched, particularly in the international field, less so in the UK. But as soon as you put it within prisons, you're literally looking at a handful of research that's done that. So, really under-researched at the moment.
And it like I say, I think it's fascinating and really interesting, but also really, really important issue because I go back and I think things have changed sort of slightly significantly in many ways. But I go back 10 years, for example, and we started off with mentioning prison radicalisation, which might be a place to start. But, 10 years ago, it was very, very much the case that almost all the criminology that I can think of when it came to discussing radicalisation in prisons and particularly Islamist extremism very often, there were kind of concerns being expressed that the prison might be a place where, for example, extremism was being cultivated by extreme Islamists with a very kind of extremist ideology. But there was almost a kind of wholesale rejection of that from criminology. Criminologists were saying, this isn't a problem and this isn't happening. That's really not the case now, is it? It's changed quite a lot.
Yeah, I think so. And you've got some prime case examples as well. Things like Massoud, the Westminster attacker. He converted to Islam in prison, potentially was radicalised. And Michael Coe, he's quite a big name at the minute because of the Jail to Jihad, I think it was on BBC. So you've got clear examples of it happening. Yes. Academia is finding other examples, less so in the public, but it is happening. And I think, like you said, over the last 10 years, people have come to realise that, well, some are arguing it's a hotbed of radicalisation, a hotbed of extremists. But even if you don't go that far, there is still radicalisation in prisons. You're putting criminals all in one place where a lot of them, their environments would never have met. And if you're getting this petty criminal that potentially might be vulnerable, and he has this cognitive opening during his prison sentence and converts to Islam, potentially becomes radicalised, I think, that's a big issue.
Absolutely. And it's very often also about putting people into prison custody, isn't it, who are the kind of negative and dangerous influence. So I remember, for example, going back a few years, people like Abu Qatada and Abu Hamza being incarcerated in our high security estate, for example. And there've been real concern about, the influence that those people or people today like Anjem Chowdhury, for example, might be able to have over other prisoners. So these kind of influential Islamists, it wasn't necessarily that they present the threat themselves. It's more so that it's the people that they can come in contact to in prison, isn't it?
Definitely, because a lot of them people you've mentioned themselves, they're very unlikely to actually go on and do a terrorist attack. They're usually a lot more about what they're saying, their preaching, their ideas, and they're the ones you've mentioned that tend to do the radicalisation because they are looked at so highly. And they radicalise, or they can radicalise people in prison, and they will radicalise them potentially to go on and do an act on release.
Yes, yeah.
So.
And like I said, it isn't necessarily always simple. It always sort of kind of simple to see or prove. But there's kind of emerging criminological work in it, isn't there? And a book that I remember we've talked about in the past that kind of came from the United States of America, and which was Mark Ham's The Spectacular Few. And Ham kind of does make that point, that actually we might be talking about quite a small kind of minority, but it's about then the potential for those that they can influence to do, really big harms potentially. Exactly.
And I think that's partly where the likes of like Ian Atkinson with his work came in the separation centres. You might be separating only a handful of people, but they might be the most influential people within the prison environment. And I think that's I know separation centres are debated, and there's very different views on it. But if you do look at the positive side of it, that is black and white. You're separating them from the rest of the prison population, and ideally you're stopping them from radicalising and passing on their views.
Yeah, absolutely. Interestingly, of course, Ian is a visiting professor with us and a very good friend of mine. But again, people may not know, but I suppose one of the big changes in this field was going back to the mid-2000s. Ian's role was under the direction of Michael Gove to look at the prison system and to see what was going on. And I think I don't think it's to kind of overstate the case. He was somewhat alarmed by I think the failure to see that there was a problem in a way. So we've moved in quite a short space of time from a denial of a problem to there being a very clear problem. But I mean, we've already talked about how that problem might be manifest in attacks and in actions of people.
Exactly.
Can you give us an example of where we've seen that play out?
I suppose I think one of the best examples, which actually shows you that it was happening many years ago and it was this denial, is Richard Reed, the shoe bomber.
Yes.
He was born in the UK to a father who was a career criminal, and he was involved in petty crime from quite a young age. And in 1992, I think it was, he was imprisoned for a few years for street robberies. So again, petty crime. And that's where he actually converted to Islam when he was in prison. Converting to Islam in itself could be a positive thing, of course. It doesn't necessarily have to be a negative thing. He could have moved away from crime. However, upon his release, he joined the Brixton Mosque. He attended the Finsbury Park Mosque. He also, I believe, he went abroad, I think to Pakistan, Afghanistan, trained, became a member of Al-Qaeda. And as a lot of people know, in the early 2000s, he attempted to detonate the shoe bomb while on the airline. So I think that's a really good example. As I said, that you're looking at the 90s and early 2000s there. And really, radicalisation in prison wasn't a hot topic until, at least after 9/11, pushing into the 2010. So I think, it's been an ongoing problem that has been denied. And I think, likewise, crime terror nexus, recently when I've been doing my research, it seems that one, there's a bit of a denial as well. Very similar with this denial.
Yeah, now we've used that term a couple of times, and it's one that I'm very familiar with, and I'm sure some people that are listening to this might be familiar with, but others might be kind of thinking, what is this crime terror nexus that they're talking about? So could you explain for anyone that's listening that doesn't know, what do criminologists mean when we talk about the crime terror nexus?
Well, I think I'll start from the beginning before coming up to more present day, I think. So the crime terror nexus was predominantly coined in 2004 by a lady called Tamara Makarenko. And she introduced this new basic linear model that looks at the linkages between organised crime and terrorism. So a lot of her work did look at international cases, not so much the UK, but she looked at these linkages such as alliances between organised crime groups and terrorist groups, appropriation of tactics, such as organised crime groups would use terror tactics to further their aims, and terrorist groups would engage in criminal activities such as financing.
Yes.
And then she also had the third linkage, which was this motivational transformations. So this would either be a terrorist group evolving to the point where their operations were primarily focused on profit, or a criminal group evolving to political agenda. So that would dominate its financial interests. That was the original model. And as I said, that you're pushing on, 15 years ago?
Yes,
Since then, there has been some changes. She did a new model in 2009, which still looked at similar stuff, but looked a little bit more at integration and hybrids. So things where groups would integrate, so they wouldn't just appropriate each other's tactics, they would literally integrate and eventually become hybrid. So you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between an organised crime group and a terrorist group. Since then,
examples
though,
of that we still see, don't we?
sorry.
Because I mean, if you think about it, although thus far, we've talked about a lot about kind of Islamism, for example. But I mean, I'm immediately drawn into, for example, where you might think about either loyalist or Republican terror groups in a way, where very often their terrorist activities, for example, were being funded by crime and drug markets and vice versa. And certainly, since the peace process, for example, we've seen a number of those that were kind of involved, move from the cause, as it were, into more entrepreneurial criminal activity. But then there's that question about whether it was always there as well, I suppose.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. And another one, I know, moving away slightly from all the British, but Italian mafia is another prime example. They were, organised crime group using terrorist tactics to secure their operational environment. In Europe in the 90s. So,
absolutely.
Yeah, we've got some real clear examples then. It's a little bit harder, I think, more presently to find them examples in Europe. You do still have, as we've mentioned, like the militant Islamist groups that have this dual criminal terrorist profile. But more recently, some work by Rajan Basra and Peter Nurman, I think it was 2016, they did some work looking more at this new crime terror nexus. And what they mean by new crime terror nexus is that due to the more recent terrorist attacks in Europe that featured nominals with a background in petty crime, this is where they started looking at petty criminals facilitating or engaging in jihadist activity. Yes. So for me, the crime terror nexus isn't solely organised criminals. You're looking at criminals. Yes. Full stop, really. Their findings found that, I can't remember the exact numbers, but there was many jihadists with criminal backgrounds that, they use that knowledge to basically be able to enhance their extremists and what they did. And Peter Nurman and Rajan Basra also mentioned prisons within there, and that's really the first time prisons were really started to mention in this crime terror nexus. I think hopefully that's a good example, a good explanation of the crime terror nexus. But
I think it's a great example because I think for a lot of people there might be a bit of a difficulty in a way in connecting it at first, but I mean ultimately although we think of a lot of those who go on, for example, to join ISIS or ISIL or Daesh, for example, as terrorist offenders, like you say, when we begin to look into their backgrounds, very often, they're punctuated with periods of prison custody for selling drugs, for violence, for low-level criminality, and that's without the discussion necessarily of prison radicalisation. But we see this sort of pathway where their kind of instrumental criminal activity gives way to a more kind of ideological criminal activity. But similarly, like you say, we ought to be alert to the fact that and again, going back, we mentioned Mark Ham earlier on, there are some very good examples in the United States, for example, if we're looking at it as a bigger picture of for example, far right and white supremacist groups robbing banks to fund their activities. It's a complex one where, essentially what we're talking about, I suppose, is, terrorists can do crime and criminals can become terrorists. And there's an overlap very often between the two in a simple way.
Particularly with the element, I think, of this appropriation of tactics. So it doesn't necessarily mean that a criminal will become an extremist and go on and do a terrorist act. Yes, that is, I think, part of the crime terror nexus personally, but it can just purely mean, let's use the prisons as the example. A criminal goes in and he knows how to money launder. He's an expert in money laundering. Well, the terrorist is in prison and the terrorist is going to be released in a year's time. He knows he needs to learn how to money launder. So he talks to someone. Absolutely. Like you would on the outside. Like, I want to know about something. I would talk to someone to try and find who I can learn it from. And that's what they're doing. This appropriation of tactics, this skills transfer. And they may not want to go to this terrorist, they may not, but they might be, I need to learn this. I don't care who it's from. It's going to benefit me on the outside. And that's what they do.
I think that's a great example, Hannah, and just to kind of illustrate again how that plays out. I mean, because we also started talking in the first instance about how that happens with organised crime. But I don't know if you've seen the Daniel Craig film Layer Cake, but there's a brilliant example of it with organised crime in Layer Cake, where Daniel Craig talks about how the prison-based armed robbers, the people who used to rob banks and so on, looking for £1 million, start to come into contact with cannabis importers who are, trying to bring in 10 or 20 million pounds worth of cannabis, who are getting 5 or 6 years in prison custody, and the armed robbers suddenly sort of start going, hold on, we're robbing banks to make £1 million, and they're getting 10 million for bringing some gear in. We're getting into that business, and so they kind of join up. And similarly, I think about that with, for example, and we do know that this has happened in prisons in the UK, how, for example, people who have been convicted, for example, of high-tech crimes or are involved in scams involving things like Bitcoin, for example, might then come into contact with organised criminals.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be a growing issue over the next few years, particularly with the increase of cyber crime and far right or right wing extremists with technical ability to do things. And I think when they go to prison, or actually even looking at vulnerable prisoners, so people with Asperger's and autistic, they've been known to be very, very good with IT and things like that. And I think that's going to be a worry in prisons, that you're going to get these high-flying terrorist or organised criminals, and they're going to use that person for their ability and skills.
Absolutely, and the good criminal tries to stay one step ahead, don't they? And always have an eye for an opportunity, whether that be a criminal terrorist or a kind of organised criminal looking for a big profit.
Exactly. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it is a really, really interesting topic. I mean, particularly when it comes to thinking about organised crime in prison. I mean, we talked about the crime terror nexus. Again, that's not necessarily something that gets a lot of thought, though, is it? Because, I mean, straight away, and I think it's a really interesting thing that you said, a lot of people immediately kind of assume, well, you go into prison and crime stops. But that isn't the case nowadays, is it?
No. And I think one thing I tend to say to people is the book by John Podmore, Out of Sight, Out of Mind. Yeah. And I think that is a really clear phrase to use in terms of, I don't think it's quite as bad as it was, but years ago, you put these particular people in prison, that's it, they're done. And for law enforcement, out of sight, out of mind. Yeah. There wasn't the money being pumped in, they can't do anything and so on. But actually, it's soon been realised that there's this conditioning of staff, that there's illicit mobiles galore, throwovers, visitors bringing things in, and there are organised criminals continuing their organised criminality whilst they're in prison. And that the normal Joe public to say that, I mean, that's a Daily Mail kind of headline. And
absolutely,
it shouldn't be the case.
And that's when we ought to. I mean, I imagine straight away some people will go, there are organised criminals continuing their organised criminality in prison. Yeah. How do they do that? Yeah. How do they do that, Hannah?
Well, I did mention a few just there, I suppose, but a lot. Well, we'll ignore COVID for now in terms of what's changed, but a lot of it is through things like they'll either form their slight gang and have that power within prison, and they will control the drugs market in prison. So they'll get people below them to get their family members to bring drugs in or whatever into the prisons. They'll orchestrate throwovers. So people throwing it over the walls. They have that power to be able to do that and control it, but they usually don't get hands-on. The organised criminals themselves, they'll never probably carry a phone and so on. But that's really how they're doing it.
So essentially, they're like the spider at the centre of the prison web. They'll run the prison market, and everybody kind of answers to them. But and even the officers,
even of some prison officers, you've got a big corruption issue with prisons. That we know it's an issue. It's really difficult, and there's a lot of prison officers that are conditioned, and I think some know they're doing it and some don't realise. I think there's a difference there as well. But you've got prison officers potentially bringing phones, whatever in, drugs and so on. And again, it's all this this network of this organised crime organising everything like they would on the outside.
And of course, you mentioned there as well, which I think is one of the things that's so vital, which is how technology has changed things. Because I only need to go back to it when I was, kind of first going into and entering into prisons back in the late 1990s, for example, to know that, the idea then of getting a mobile phone into a prison, you'd have needed more than a drone to carry it in with you. I mean, to the size of those mobile phones. But now you've got kind of tiny little mobile phones, very easily concealed, and they've got kind of smaller and easier to maneuver. And the mobile phone really does transform your ability to do things in prison, doesn't it?
Definitely. I think it's all about communication. And if you don't have that communication, you don't have that availability of a phone, it's hard. It's definitely hard. And like you said, they are no word of a lie. You can get phones now the size of your little finger. And that's crazy, because to think where you can put that to hide it, you know what I mean? So it's very easy to get them in. And if you've got that phone and you can communicate with the outside, you can do bank transfers on it, you can get your family to do the bank transfers, whatever it might be, you're winning.
Absolutely. Nothing stops in terms of the business that you were running on the outside. For example, you can continue to be running your empire, but from inside a prison.
Exactly. However, I do think, though, in the last, I'd say, few years, there has been a drive for prisons in terms of there's been big investments in prison. They are trying to not be out of sight, out of mind kind of thing. And there's new systems coming in, like airport security things like that have been starting to come in. They've been really pushing for anti-corruption. I know that a lot of law enforcement have been working with the prisons, and that intelligence sharing has been improved. There has been a lot of improvements. It's just still not enough.
Absolutely. And I think it's a really interesting one, because like I say, one of my frustrations has been, the lack of evidence and the lack of academic interest in these areas in some ways. I mean, for example, you mentioned prison officer corruption, and there's not very much written, for example, about police corruption, but there's almost nothing at all written about prison officer corruption, and certainly nothing that looks at, for example, the roles of other support staff going in prisons who might be convicted of criminal offences. And we also know that, it can be doctors, education workers, nurses, social workers, probation officers.
Cleaners.
Cleaners, absolutely, contractors, people going
all your
to
contractors.
maintenance.
Because at the end of the day, I know this has happened more recently with COVID, because they're not getting visits. So you've got a prison officer, or any of them ones we've just mentioned, walking down the street and they've been witnessed in prison, they'll get their family member to go up to them and say, look, I'll pay you £1,000 to take in this.
Absolutely.
And don't get me wrong, I wouldn't accept that. However, many people would, because they need £1,000. And they don't see the bigger picture of it. They just do it.
And again, it's something that we don't necessarily talk about a lot in criminology, but there's a lot of money to be made in prisons, isn't there?
Yes, definitely.
Because in a way, the prison is a controlled environment where it's very hard to get the luxuries or the things that people might want, be that, drugs or alcohol or even weapons and phones. So those things kind of smuggled from the outside have a much, much higher value when you get them, into the prison.
They do, definitely. And more so, again, recently with COVID, the price of drugs and phones have skyrocketed in prisons, because it's just.
Can you tell us something of that? I mean, what would we be talking about for the price of a mobile phone in prison?
I would, because I don't do the prison department so much now. I wouldn't know the exact cost anymore. To be honest.
No, that's fine. But
as I said, I know they've gone up just because it's harder to get them in.
Yeah,
because you've not got your visits. Your throwovers are being orchestrated, but they're not going in the gardens as much, so they're harder. Everything is just harder to get in at the minute.
It's the logic of the market, isn't it, really? If demand is high but supply is low, people can put the prices up.
Exactly.
And it's no different in prisons. I heard when I've done research on it wasn't surprising to hear, if a phone cost £100 on the outside, it would trade hands for £500 on the inside.
If not more.
And more in some cases. And of course,
especially on the phone.
Yeah,
You
absolutely.
can
And
get a smartphone in. Yeah.
loads of money. Well,
Yeah.
of course, you can do your, as you say, you can do your banking transactions. You can make your rap videos on it.
You
You
got
know,
on your
there's
social
all sorts.
media. Yeah.
Absolutely. But
Yeah.
an interesting one as well into that kind of discussion that we were having in a way is, if you think about the kind of value, and we were talking about the value of getting the mobile phones in, and the high value that was attached, because the other side of it is that it also drives a lot of debt in prison, doesn't it?
Yes.
And that's a bit of a problem, because the debt quite often underscores a lot of the violence, and like any kind of field with organised crime, when people don't pay up, or when they get into debt and can't pay up, they don't get taken to the small claims court.
No, exactly. And like you said, it either can cause violence inside, violence on the outside, family members, threats. I mean, there's plenty of examples of when someone owes something in prison and they go to their family for it. So they've gone, the organised criminal might have got a friend and gone knock on their mum's door. Well, your son owes me £1,000. Well, so yeah, it's definitely, and I think that goes back sort of to the vulnerability in prisons. You've got this, I suppose inequality in prisons. If you've got them organised criminals that are controlling the wings, they've got the power, but then you've also got them vulnerable prisoners potentially with mental health issues and so on, or drug abuse even. And they're the ones that, I mean, for the prisons particularly, that's a big issue, because ultimately the objective of the prison is safety. And if they're not keeping them safe with the violence, it's not great.
Absolutely. No, it's really, I mean, I think it's really, really interesting and kind of fascinating topic. And I'm aware we've taken quite some time already, but there are a couple of other things that I really wanted to talk about, because I think they're cases and examples that people will find really, really interesting. So, I mean, we started off talking particularly about kind of radicalisation. We've just talked about the kind of conditions in prison and the organised crime that goes on. But there is also a challenge, isn't there? Particularly now when we talk about organised crime and the crime terror nexus, but also the problem of terrorist crime in our prisons. And that hasn't been a concern for criminology historically, really, has it?
No, it hasn't at all. And I think, again, probably in the last 5 years, it started to grow, because you've really got these tact offenders that are going into prison, or I suppose even not tact offenders, going into prison. So they could be radicalised if it's a normal criminal. And then there's either a chance for actually extremist behaviour in prison. So the prime example we've got is HMP Whitemore. I think, when was that? Was it January last year?
Yeah, Zamani and Hockton.
Yeah, January last year.
Absolutely. I don't think, again, I'd say those names, but people may not necessarily have heard of Whitemore. I think when they have heard of Whitemore, it's often Whitemore's in the backdrop to Usman Khan when he comes out and kills two people at Fishmonger Hall. But that's not the Whitemore that we're talking about, because the incident we're talking about, because these were prisoners in the same prison, weren't they? What did they do, Hannah?
If I can remember rightly, I think, was it Zamani was already in prison for tax offences. I think right. And Hockton was his associate, his friend in prison. So he was radicalised within prison, I believe. And they managed to acquire weapons in the prison. I'm not sure if these were handmade or actual weapons. I know they handmade a pretend vest, suicide vest. And they attacked a prison officer. That prison officer nearly died. Thankfully, he didn't die, but he did nearly die. It was a very violent attack. So law enforcement got straight involved. They were removed. And I know, actually, because it was quite recent, they got convicted of extremist behaviour in prison, a terrorist attack in prison.
So a terrorist offence in a prison, and again, I think this is an important one, because I think for many people there's this kind of idea, and it's like you were saying, kind of out of sight, out of mind. If you catch the terrorist and you put them in prison, well, then we're safe, but it's not necessarily safe for the staff, is it?
No,
that to work with them.
And I know Jonathan Hall is looking into this, the QC, the independent advisor of terrorism legislation. He's doing a report of looking at extremism in prison and the lack of prisoners being convicted of either radicalisation, extremist behaviour, terrorist acts whilst they're in prison. On the outside, they would be convicted. Yeah. So it seems to be a lot of the time going amiss because, I suppose, the other demands on the prison. I think it's really a hot topic, actually, I think, at the minute. And I think Jonathan Hall's review is a really good timing. It'll be interesting to see what's come out of that. And hopefully prisons will start actually convicting prisoners. I think people argue that at the end of the day, they're in prison for 10 years. What's an extra 4 months? But if that 4 months keeps going on and on and on and on, they've got to eventually stop because they're never going to be released.
Yeah.
That's my view.
Interestingly, in the case of Zamani and Hockton, both were. I mean, it was attempted murder they were convicted of, so they were both given life sentences. Yeah. I think Zamani was already serving a fairly lengthy sentence, wasn't he? But in both cases, a life sentence. Well, actually, I think both were serving substantial sentences, but now they're serving, an additional 20 odd years on them. I suppose with that, although as I said before, it doesn't necessarily keep the staff safe. There is that we're continuing to keep the wider public safe, as it were. So
I think being a prison officer nowadays, even before I suppose, but the risk you are under is ridiculous. And they're probably not, I don't know how much they pay, but they're probably not paid enough for what they do. And that is partly why you get the corruption elements to it. And you've also got a lot of prison officers that are young. They're 20, 18, 19, maybe just left college, and they are quite vulnerable to this, to many things, conditioning to get the weapons in and so on, and the corruption. And just to think, if I was a 20-year-old in Whitemoor trying to discipline and police prisoners, I don't want to be doing that.
I mean, I do try and kind of keep the politics side of it out, but I do think it's the hidden side of criminal justice, and in many ways, the other agencies are often sort of far better seen, but the prison service kind of are very easily the kind of forgotten.
Definitely.
The forgotten service in the criminal justice system. I would kind of agree with you. I don't think that they're paid nearly enough. Actually, they're not paid as much as police officers, but again it opens up interesting questions potentially about how you might look at their role, and because very often it is kind of walking a tightrope between having the power of constable and being a police officer, but also then trying to be the social worker and living in an environment every day alongside those who in some instances, may put you at significant risk. So it's a really, really complex one. And I think, perhaps we ought to come back and do some more on the role of the prison officer, because as I say, this series we've been looking at policing, but it's kind of interesting in that we forget the prison officer's role essentially as being that on par with a police officer as well. Which again,
and I think that goes back to also their training. I know there's been a big investment in prison officers training, and it is better than what it was, but I still don't think there's enough. And even during my research over the last few months, a lot of my participants have said that there needs to be more training, and it needs to be more often. They get this dose of training at the beginning, which is pretty good training. They are getting decent enough, but then that's it. And they've got occasional stuff going on, like aspects and different PDR stuff, but it's not enough. There needs to be every 6 months this refresh of how to understand the difference between converting to Islam and radicalisation, to understand what conditioning is, to understand to do all this stuff. There needs to be more regular training for prison officers.
Absolutely. And of course, I think it's an interesting one as well. And I've said this more generally about the police as well. At times it's that disconnect between the police role and the prison officer role, where actually when you put them together, they really do then begin to appreciate what each agency does. Yes. But often, for a lot of the time, with a few exceptions in terms of prison liaison officers and so on, very few police officers, have much experience of prison and
you're right.
Vice versa.
Yeah, like you said, you have prison liaison officers, prison intelligence officers, and they will be, the first point of call for for police going into prisons.
Yes.
But like you said, unless you've been in that role, you wouldn't really know, particularly the first thing about prisons, how to get information. Sometimes, how to even get a prisoner so you can have an interview and so on. Yeah. You really don't know. There is this disconnect. Thankfully, them two roles, I think a lot of them do a very good job of it. And I have worked with them in my job, and they're exceptional. And I think they're exceptional in terms of trying to keep that relationship going, the relationship between the police and the prisons in order to police prisons.
Absolutely. And of course, never really subject to any academic study. But that's something that you're doing that's a bit different, isn't it? You are now talking to them about their role.
Exactly.
Which I think is fascinating and interesting, and does give us a reason to come back and talk again at some point in the future. Just as we kind of close out there, Hannah, there was one more thing that I kind of wanted to talk to you about, because in some ways we have looked at it as a contemporary concern, and I suppose we were talking about the crime terror nexus and crime in prison. I mean, I never quite know how to usher in the debate in some ways, but because in many ways, I suppose it is about prison security as well. But although we haven't been using that term, but concern about prison security isn't necessarily new, is it? And the concern about kind of organised criminals associating with perhaps more organised criminals, and what can happen if prisons and the authorities aren't on top of it. And one thing I know that you've focused in on and looked a bit at in your research is the history of where that's happened. But in particular, you've looked at the Woodcock report, haven't you?
Yep.
Now, again, I don't suppose necessarily all of the listeners will know about the Woodcock report, but could you tell us what happened to lead up to the Woodcock report, and what it was about and what it was? Because I think it does show in some ways that this is a longer concern.
Yeah, definitely. So the Woodcock report, I knew of, like I think other people have mentioned, I knew of the Woodcock report, but I didn't really know much else than it was a report about escapes. That's all I really knew. So I decided to have a little bit more of a look into it. And I think as we've had a laugh about, James, it opens up with,
it is
along the lines of, as one evening when there was prison officers on duty, they were alerted to the sight of, I think it was 6 prisoners jumping over the prison wall, escaping. Yes, while four of them were playing Scrabble. Yeah. One of them was reading a book, and 2 in the control, something along them lines. And it's quite a good opening.
It's the most beautifully it's the most beautifully dry and sort of sarcastic and cutting commentary, where I think I should say 4 of the 7 officers on the unit had been playing Scrabble, and that they were on this busy and important work, It's
ultimately the report itself is a really good report, and it is about these prisoners that escaped from Whitemore. I believe it was 1996, I think. Right. And they escaped from Whitemore, and the prison officers, as we've just pointed out, were busy with other commitments.
It was 94.
Was it 94?
94. Sorry. But it was what was called the SSU, so the Special Secure Unit at Whitemore.
A segregation unit.
Yeah, absolutely. Which if people don't know, I mean, this is supposed to be a prison within a prison.
Yes.
And
they escaped.
And they escaped. Yes.
And not only did they escape, but the methodology of how they escaped was astounding, because the amount of equipment they had. I think if I remember rightly, they'd made ladders. They'd got guns because they shot I think 1 or 2 prison officers.
They had 2 pistols with them. managed to they'd managed to get a pair of it was particularly the pair of bolt croppers, I think, as well as the firearms, that they'd managed to get these into the most kind of high security part, and this happened at a time where there was concern more generally about prison security, because there had been a couple of couple of incidents that had, albeit none quite so extreme as Whitemore, I think, but in this case there were also paramilitaries, weren't they?
Yeah, I think it might have been, some of them were IRA, I believe, and there was one that was like a gang member in London, I think. Yeah. So they obviously worked together to do this, and I think the main point from the report itself, and this is maybe where I'm going to kind of start a lot of my research from, is that the report produced a host of like identifications of like this bad practice of what was going on with lax security, ineffective searching. There was just a catalogue of unearned privileges for the SSU inmates.
Yes.
And I think that was why it was just so important that they did this report, because as I actually said to one of my participants, we said that, don't get me wrong, there has been changes from this report, but at the same time, that conditioning of staff is still out there today. And I think that's really important, that, prisoners are still getting these things into prisons. They are still conditioning staff. They are still doing so. So we've still got these problems now, and this report is pushing on. Is it 25 years ago?
Well, yeah, absolutely, and of course, I suppose there have always been. It's one of the things I say is that a lot of the time we hear prison doesn't work, but it does work quite well at some things. I mean, there have been examples that run counter to it, but prison is largely quite good at keeping people in prison custody.
Well, if it wasn't, it wouldn't be around the world at the end of the day.
Absolutely. But there are some exceptional cases that prove that not always, because, we have got Charles Wilson and Ronald Biggs that managed to escape from Wandsworth. George Blake from Wormwood Scrubs, which is one of my favourite topics. I love talking about George Blake. But then, of course, we had Whitemore as well. And again, it brings it back to organised crime. The first escape of a Category A prisoner was John Ashton, who was Category A prisoner broken free from prisoner transportation, for example. So it does still happen.
Yeah, it does.
But it is quite rare, actually, and prisons largely do quite well. When we say prison doesn't work, it does work quite well at locking people up and keeping them in custody.
And safety. At the end of the day, I think that the prisons have this objective to keep the prison safe, good order and discipline, and they've got a lot of demands going on. It's not just having this one in, one out. They've got so much to contend with. And generally, prisons, I think, do work, and they do a good job. There's just always room for improvement. Given the difficulty and the complexity of the people that they have in them, I think it's sometimes it's sometimes easy to overlook how well they do a lot of the time. And just look at the failings and look at the things that aren't working.
Yes.
And really, at the end of the day, it does work well. There is a lot of good things from it. It's just like all agencies and establishments, there is always room for improvement, within the police, security services, wherever, universities. So, I think it's a really good report for sure. And it definitely, as I said, shows this dilemma between good order and policing the prisons.
Absolutely.
I would recommend everyone read it, because it's a good read.
Yeah, it's worth reading just for the kind of the wonderful sarcasm of the opening paragraphs, which I think are just absolutely fantastic. But it's great that you're undertaking research on this topic, Hannah, because I think it does sort of show that sometimes I think people kind of struggle to see where criminology and policing and academia kind of connect with real world social problems, but I certainly think here at Staffordshire, you know, a lot of the research that we are doing, right the way through from some of our forensic scientists looking at, you know, the kind of how drugs are made to be smuggled into prison, right the way through to the kind of crime terror network and policing prisons, really is quite important and significant in shaping a dialogue. And I think it's brilliant that you're part of it, and I think the research that you're doing is fantastic. So thank you so much for joining me today to talk about that.
No problem. Thanks, James.